They just uncovered shocking new data about the StuG III cruise, and it's worse than we thought. With over 10,000 of these vehicles produced, you'd assume they had staying power. But by the end of the war, barely 1,300 were left, and nearly 84% of the men who fought inside them had been killed or wounded. Why did Germany's deadliest tank killer become a coffin on tracks? From its rushed transformation into a frontline destroyer to suicidal ambush missions with no backup. The story of the StuG III is one of brutal innovation and quiet sacrifice. This is the dark truth. It wasn't designed to be famous. It wasn't even designed to survive. When the German military conceived the Sturmgeschütz III, better known as the StuG III, it wasn't built to take on tanks or break enemy lines. It was a stopgap, an artillery solution, not a combat superstar. Originally, German generals simply needed a mobile cannon that could follow infantry and blast apart concrete bunkers and fortified machine gun nests. Standard field guns were too slow to deploy. And tanks? Too expensive, too rare, and always in short supply. So they took an already existing Panzer III chassis, stripped away the turret, and fixed a short-barreled 75mm howitzer into a low-slung casemate. No rotating turret, no backup crew compartments, no frills, just a cannon bolted to a metal box. But what the Germans didn't anticipate was how quickly this modest vehicle would be thrust into battles it was never meant to fight. The artillerymen who crewed the first StuGs weren't trained tankers. They were gunners, disciplined, mathematical, and clinical in their operations. Their goal wasn't glory, it was precision. In the 1940 Battle of France, StuGs knocked out pillboxes and fortresses with cold efficiency. Their low silhouette made them ideal for hiding in ruined towns or tree lines. To the infantry, they were a blessing. To the high command, they were practical. And to the enemy, they were barely noticed. That invisibility would soon change. As the tides of war escalated, Germany would throw these vehicles into roles they were never designed for. Frontline tank duels, last-stand defenses, urban battles. The same qualities that once made the StuG a quiet battlefield companion would make it a magnet for disaster. And the men inside? They became some of the war's most expendable heroes. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa shattered the illusion of German superiority. As 500,000 German troops stormed into the Soviet Union, they found themselves face-to-face with armored behemoths that changed the entire game. The T-34 and the KV-1. These Soviet tanks weren't just powerful, they were revolutionary. Their sloped armor, wide tracks, and high-velocity cannons stunned the advancing Wehrmacht. Anti-tank rifles bounced off. The Panzer III's gun was laughably inadequate, and the StuG III's original short-barreled howitzer? Useless. Suddenly, the StuG wasn't a support tool, it was a liability. But there was no time for long-term solutions. German engineers scrambled to retrofit the StuG with something that could punch back. The answer came in the form of the 75mm StuG 40L/48 gun, a high-velocity cannon adapted from the PaK-40 anti-tank gun. Mounted into the same turretless chassis, this modification transformed the StuG III into a lethal tank destroyer almost overnight. But it was still a compromise. The fixed gun couldn't rotate, so aiming required turning the entire vehicle. The armor was modest, especially on the sides and top. And crucially, the crew, still trained as artillerymen, were now fighting tanks in open-field duels. They adapted quickly. Soviet armor often charged in massive waves. But StuG crews used their old skills: range calculation, ambush positioning, precision fire. They became snipers in steel boxes, hiding in shell holes and forest lines, waiting for the perfect shot. By mid-1942, these modified StuGs were racking up kill counts that rivaled dedicated tanks. But the price was immense. Crews were overworked, undersupported, and constantly moved from one hot zone to another. They were no longer backing up infantry. They were the last line of defense. And the stress of that role began to wear down the very men who had once prided themselves on discipline. The StuG had become deadly, but only if you survived long enough to fire. By 1943, the StuG III was no longer a quiet support weapon. It had become the backbone of Germany's tank-killing effort. While Tigers and Panthers were glorified in propaganda reels, the reality on the Eastern Front was different. For every elite tank crew rolling in a Tiger, there were 10 StuG crews buried in frozen fields, waiting to ambush. And they were effective, brutally so. The StuG's silhouette was its greatest weapon. At just under 2 meters tall, it could disappear into terrain folds, rubble piles, or dense tree lines. Soviet T-34s, built for fast assaults, often charged blindly into these zones, only to be ripped apart by precision shots. German reports from the Battle of Kursk noted entire Soviet tank companies decimated by StuG fire with barely any German losses. In one case, a single StuG battalion claimed to destroy over 400 tanks with less than 10 vehicles lost. But these statistics came at a horrifying cost. Ambush tactics required patience, hours lying still in freezing cold or blistering heat. Crews couldn't move. Engines stayed off. If spotted, there was no rotating turret to swing the gun into position. The only chance was to reverse or turn the entire hull, if the engine even started in time. And when they fired, Soviet artillery immediately rained down on their location. The crew was 4 men: the driver, the loader, the commander, and the gunner. All in one compartment. A penetrating shell didn't just kill, it vaporized the inside. Survivors told stories of seeing friends blown apart inches away, their uniforms set ablaze by hot fragments. There was no room for error, no luxury of compartmentalization. If the StuG was hit, the crew almost always died together. Despite this, they kept fighting. Not out of fanaticism, but because retreat wasn't an option. They were Germany's fire brigades, sent to every collapsing front, every failed breakthrough, every doomed counterattack. And they made it work. For a while. But every kill they scored brought them closer to their own inevitable end. The StuG's greatest flaw was also what made it affordable. It had no turret. In the early stages of the war, this wasn't seen as a fatal weakness. After all, it wasn't supposed to be fighting other tanks. But as it was repurposed into an anti-tank platform, that lack of mobility became a death sentence. The gun was fixed in the hull, meaning it could only pivot slightly side to side. Anything outside that narrow arc required the entire vehicle to turn. In urban combat or fast-paced battles, this was often impossible. On the open plains of Russia, a StuG could wait silently for its prey, pick the perfect angle, and fire with deadly accuracy. But in places like Stalingrad or Budapest, where the front lines zigzagged through apartment blocks and factory ruins, the limitations became fatal. Soviet troops learned to exploit these blind spots. Infantry carrying Molotov cocktails, satchel charges, or anti-tank rifles would swarm the flanks. Once close, the StuG's crew had almost no way to respond. Even the addition of a roof-mounted MG-34 machine gun did little to help. Many gunners exposed themselves only to be shot within seconds. The claustrophobia inside a StuG was suffocating. With 4 men packed shoulder to shoulder in a tight steel shell, there was little room to maneuver, let alone escape. Hatches were small. Visibility was limited to narrow periscopes or slit-thin viewports. Once inside and locked down, you were sealed in with your fate. When a Soviet anti-tank rifle hit the thinner side or rear armor, the spall would ricochet inside like a shotgun blast. Sometimes, crews were killed not by penetration, but by fragments of their own armor breaking loose and shredding them. Commanders begged for better visibility, faster traverse, thicker armor. What they got instead were orders to hold the line, no matter the cost. And those costs grew heavier by the month. StuGs weren't meant to retreat. They were meant to delay. They became stationary guns in a war that never stopped moving, and the men inside them knew that sooner or later something faster, stronger, or luckier would find them. As Germany's situation deteriorated in 1944, StuG crews were no longer just fighting the Soviets. They were being hurled against Allied advances in Italy, France, and even inside Germany itself. Wherever the front collapsed, the call went out. Not for Tigers or elite SS units, but for the StuG battalions. They were the Feuerwehr, the fire brigade, rushed from one catastrophe to the next. This wasn't by accident. The StuG III had become the most produced German armored vehicle of the entire war. Over 10,000 units rolled off the assembly lines, many using repurposed Panzer III chassis that were no longer fit for tank combat. It was cheaper than a Tiger and more reliable than a Panther. But quantity couldn't fix exhaustion. Crews were pushed to the edge. Maintenance was spotty. Ammo was rationed. And the enemy now had complete control of the skies. That meant the StuG wasn't just vulnerable to enemy tanks. It was hunted from above. Jabos, Allied fighter bombers like the P-47 Thunderbolt, swept the roads and fields, looking for anything with a cross on it. The thin roof armor of the StuG, sometimes only 10 to 15 millimeters thick, was no match for rockets or bombs. Some crews tried to weld spare tracks or concrete slabs to the top, hoping for extra protection. But most knew it wouldn't matter. Even more devastating was how the Wehrmacht used them. Entire StuG units were thrown into battles without infantry support, artillery cover, or air protection. They were told to stop entire armored thrusts alone. If they succeeded, they bought time. If they failed, no one expected them to come back. Survivors described driving all night to reach a crumbling village, only to be told they had an hour to prepare for an enemy tank assault. They weren't elite units. They were triage, delaying the inevitable. And still, they fought. Not out of loyalty to the regime, but because they had no other choice. Desertion meant execution. Capture meant brutal interrogation or death. Staying in the vehicle, no matter how damaged, was often seen as the only hope. The StuG had become a coffin on tracks, one that moved only forward. By the final year of the war, death inside a StuG could come from any direction, and it often did. Allied armor was improving rapidly. British Churchills and American Shermans, while individually less effective than a StuG in ambush, began arriving in overwhelming numbers. Their tactics changed too. Instead of charging blindly, they used smoke, artillery barrages, and coordinated flanks to flush out German anti-tank positions. The StuGs, with their fixed guns, were easy prey. Inside the vehicle, the psychological toll was unbearable. Most crews had already survived multiple battles, lost friends, and suffered wounds. Shell shock or combat fatigue was rampant. Replacement crews, hastily trained and often underage, had no time to learn the tactics that had once made StuG units so deadly. They were told how to drive, how to fire, and then sent to the front. Some were barely 17 years old. One of the darkest aspects of the StuG design was that when it was hit, it wasn't just the vehicle that died, it was everyone inside. The small crew compartment meant that a single penetrating shell could detonate the ammo rack, rupture the fuel tank, and incinerate the entire interior. Rescue was almost impossible. The flames burned fast, the steel bent inward, and if the hatches were jammed, which they often were, it became a fiery tomb. The numbers tell the rest of the story. Of the 10,000-plus StuGs built, fewer than 1,500 were still operational by the end of the war. Over 84% were destroyed in action, abandoned, or captured. But even more staggering was the human cost. Entire battalions were wiped out, some never replaced. The German High Command considered them expendable, and history almost forgot them. Yet for all the brutality and hopelessness, these crews kept fighting. Not because they believed in victory, but because they had each other. Brothers in steel boxes, bracing for the shell that had their name on it. In the darkest corners of the war, they became legends, not through glory, but through endurance. The crews of the StuG III were some of the most uncelebrated and invisible soldiers of World War II. Unlike Tiger tank commanders or Luftwaffe aces, they weren't featured in propaganda posters or newsreels. Their names didn't echo in Nazi speeches. They were often nameless gunners, loaders, and drivers, assigned to steel boxes without turrets, fighting desperate battles the public never heard about. But their impact on the war was undeniable. Some of Germany's highest tank kill counts didn't come from Tigers or Panthers. They came from StuGs. Veteran commanders like Franz Becke and Kurt Knispel started or completed their careers in assault guns, racking up tank kills that made them legends. Yet their association with the cheap StuG kept them out of the limelight. Because the vehicle was never meant to be a symbol of pride, it was a tool, a necessary, brutal machine made for survival, not glory. The crews felt this too. Letters from soldiers assigned to StuGs reveal exhaustion, bitterness, and fatalism. Many of them didn't believe in victory anymore, especially after 1943. They weren't fighting for ideology. They were fighting for the man sitting next to them. Most of the time, they didn't even know where they were being sent. Orders came down. The StuG was loaded with shells, and they moved, often at night, often alone. A handful of men, outnumbered and forgotten. These were not the polished, idealized Germans of the Wehrmacht's early blitzkrieg. By 1944, most StuG crews looked like ghosts, dirty, malnourished, hollow-eyed, uniforms in tatters. Many had seen the inside of their vehicle catch fire. Some had crawled out of burning wrecks. Others replaced friends who never made it out. In winter, they froze in their compartments. In summer, they boiled. Morale collapsed. But they still climbed back in. They still fought. And when the war ended, very few came home to tell their story. As the Third Reich crumbled in 1945, the role of the StuG III changed once again. It was no longer just a tank destroyer or an infantry support vehicle. It became a symbol of desperation. In the final months of the war, there were no longer front lines. Cities became battlegrounds. Forests turned into ambush points. Villages were abandoned or destroyed. And through all of it, the StuG was still rolling. Barely. Fuel was gone. Ammo was scarce. Spare parts were non-existent. Many crews scavenged destroyed vehicles just to keep moving. There were even cases where disabled StuGs were used as bunkers, buried into the ground, the gun still protruding like a final middle finger to the enemy. Some were operated by Hitler Youth, others by old men conscripted in the Volkssturm. Discipline dissolved. Communications broke down. And yet, crews stayed inside their vehicles, waiting for the next shell, the next wave of tanks, the next moment they might have to fire or die. The last combat use of StuGs occurred during the Battle of Berlin. Soviet tanks poured into the city like a steel flood. StuGs, now almost completely obsolete, were deployed in narrow streets where their low profiles made them ideal for ambush. But their lack of mobility was a death trap. Some fought from behind barricades, others fired point-blank before being destroyed seconds later. Survivors described horrifying scenes of StuGs burning in alleys, of crews charred alive inside with their hands melted to controls, of vehicles fighting until their last shell was gone, then used as cover by retreating infantry. The Waffen-SS, the Volkssturm, and remnants of the Wehrmacht all used whatever StuGs remained. But by that point, no one expected to live. By war's end, out of the over 10,000 built, only a small fraction remained. Even fewer had crews still alive. In some units, casualty rates were over 90%. Some entire battalions were erased from the map, their records destroyed, their names never entered into any official history. Their last stand had already been forgotten before the ashes had even cooled. What made the StuG III such a deadly coffin wasn't just its armor or lack of turret. It was the psychological reality of its design. The fighting compartment was cramped and unventilated. When the gun fired, the noise was deafening, the interior filled with cordite and smoke. There was barely room to stand. If the loader was slow by even a second, it could mean death. The crew relied entirely on each other, but also knew that if one man died, the rest usually did too. There were only a few ways out. If the front hatch jammed, you had to crawl over the gun or squeeze through the loader's hatch. But if the vehicle was burning, seconds mattered. And StuGs burned fast. The fuel tank sat close to the engine. The ammo storage wasn't protected. When hit, even a glancing blow could rupture something vital. And once the fire started, smoke filled the cabin in seconds. Most crews didn't suffocate or bleed out. They burned. And that's how 84% of them died. The death toll wasn't the result of bad tactics or poor engineering. It was the role itself. The StuG was always on the front. Always where the fighting was thickest. It was cheaper to build than other tanks, so it was sent more places to fight more enemies in more hopeless situations. There was no air support, no reinforcements, no promise of rescue. Just a low-slung metal box, a long 75mm cannon, and 4 men trying to survive another hour. Their legacy is one of brutal efficiency and brutal sacrifice. These weren't the glamorous tank commanders of Nazi propaganda. They were the forgotten gunners, the drivers who froze in place, the loaders who screamed when the roof was peeled open by an enemy shell, the commanders who looked through smoke-smeared periscopes, knowing they were seconds from being flanked. And they kept fighting. The StuG III crews did not win the war. They did not change its outcome. But they became its grinding, gray backbone, a symbol of industrialized death, of sacrifice without reward, and of men who lived and died in silence, sealed in steel and swallowed by history.